The scorching summer heat of 1878 showed no mercy on the small frontier town of Lusk, Wyoming Territory. As Cecilia Nightingale staggered through the brambles and brush of the unforgiving landscape, her throat raw, her voice now nothing but a raspy whisper of what it had once been. 3 days of captivity and countless hours of desperate screams for help had left her vocal cords shattered, but her will to survive remained unbroken. Cecilia's fingers clawed at the dusty earth as she pulled herself forward, the tattered remains of her once fine dress catching on every thorn and branch. Her captors were surely not far behind. The Blackwell Gang had made it clear no one escaped their clutches and lived to tell about it. But Cecilia, with nothing but desperation and the fierce desire to live, had managed to slip away while they argued over their next move after a bungled bank robbery in Cheyenne. The sun beat down mercilessly, and her parched lips cracked as she tried to call out upon seeing smoke rising from what appeared to be a small ranch in the distance. But no sound came, just a painful, hollow rasp that burned her throat like fire. Her vision blurred as exhaustion threatened to overtake her. Just a little further, she urged herself. Just a little further. Yates Forrester had been breaking a new Mustang in the corral when he spotted what looked like a heap of fabric moving along the edge of his property. Shielding his eyes against the harsh Wyoming sun, he squinted to make out the form of a woman crawling on her hands and knees toward his ranch. He immediately released the horse from the training line and vaulted over the fence, his spurs kicking up dust as he ran toward the collapsed figure. "Miss. Miss, can you hear me?" Yates knelt beside the woman, gently turning her over. Her face was dirty and scratched, her hair tangled with twigs and leaves. But even through the grime, he could see she was young, perhaps in her early 20s, and despite her current state, possessed a natural beauty that took him aback. Cecilia's eyes fluttered open at his touch, wide with terror. She scrambled backward, her mouth opening in what should have been a scream, but only produced a painful, barely audible hiss. Her hands flew to her throat, clutching it as tears of frustration and fear pooled in her hazel eyes. "It's all right," Yates said softly, removing his hat and holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I won't hurt you. You're safe now." His voice was deep but gentle, with the slight drawl typical of men who'd spent years in the Western Territories. Cecilia tried again to speak, but no words came. In desperation, she pointed toward the horizon, making frantic gestures to indicate people following her. Yates looked in the direction she pointed, his brow furrowing. "Someone after you?" he asked quietly. She nodded vigorously, her expression pleading. "How many?" he asked, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. Cecilia held up 5 fingers, then clutched at her throat again, frustrated by her inability to explain the danger. "Don't worry about talking right now," Yates said, understanding immediately. "Your voice, you've heard it somehow." He glanced around, making a quick decision. "Let's get you to safety first." In one fluid motion, he scooped her up, surprised at how light she felt in his arms. Cecilia stiffened initially, then relaxed, her body too exhausted to fight what her instincts told her was a rescue, not another threat. Yates carried her quickly toward the modest but sturdy log ranch house, calling out as he approached. "Martha, Martha, I need your help." An older woman with silver-streaked hair tied back in a practical bun appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened at the sight of the battered woman in Yates's arms. "Good heavens, what happened to her?" Martha asked, already moving aside to let them enter. "Not sure," Yates replied, setting Cecilia gently on a chair in the kitchen. "Found her crawling toward the property. She can't speak, throat's damaged somehow, and she's indicating there are 5 men following her." Martha's weathered face hardened. She had been the Forrester family's housekeeper since Yates was a boy, staying on to help him run the ranch after his parents died of fever 3 years earlier. At 55, she was as tough as any frontier woman had to be, and her loyalty to Yates was unwavering. "I'll fetch water and clean her up," Martha said decisively. "You do what needs doing." Yates nodded, understanding perfectly what Martha meant. He knelt before Cecilia, meeting her frightened gaze. "Miss, I'm going to make sure those men don't find you here. Martha will take care of you. You're safe now, I promise." His blue eyes held such certainty that Cecilia found herself believing him despite the terror still coursing through her. She reached out impulsively, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. She pointed to herself, then made a writing motion with her hand. "You want to write something down?" Yates asked. Cecilia nodded emphatically. "Martha, fetch some paper and a pencil, would you?" Yates called. When Martha returned with the requested items, Cecilia's hands trembled so badly she could barely hold the pencil. She managed to scrawl, "Blackwell Gang, kidnapped me in Cheyenne. Dangerous." Yates's expression darkened as he read the note. The Blackwell Gang was notorious throughout the territory: bank robbers, kidnappers, and killers who had evaded the law for years. Their leader, Jeremiah Blackwell, was said to be as cruel as he was cunning. "I know of them," Yates said grimly. "Don't worry, I won't let them take you." Cecilia wrote again. "Cecilia Nightingale, please help." "Miss Nightingale," Yates said with a respectful nod. "I'm Yates Forrester. This is Martha Coleman. You're on my ranch about 15 miles outside of Lusk." He stood, his tall frame suddenly seeming even larger as determination set his shoulders. "Martha will tend to you. I'll be back soon." As Yates strode toward the door, he grabbed his Winchester repeating rifle from its place above the fireplace and checked that it was loaded. He paused, looking back at Cecilia. "They won't hurt you again, that's a promise." The door closed behind him, and Cecilia felt a strange mix of fear and relief wash over her. Martha's gentle hands guided her to stand. "Come, child, let's get you cleaned up and into some fresh clothes. You're safe with us now." Yates Forrester is a man of his word, and I've never known him to break a promise. As Martha helped her toward a small bedroom at the back of the house, Cecilia could only hope the kind housekeeper was right. Because if Yates failed, the Blackwell Gang would show no mercy to anyone who had tried to help her. Outside, Yates mounted his chestnut gelding, Thunder, and rode toward the rise that overlooked his property. From there, he'd have a clear view of anyone approaching. His mind raced with questions about the young woman now in his home. What had she endured? Why had the Blackwell Gang taken her specifically? Such a refined-looking woman must have family somewhere, people who were worried about her, but those questions would have to wait. Right now, his priority was ensuring her safety. Yates had spent most of his 28 years on this land. He knew every ridge, every gully, every advantage the terrain could offer, and he was determined to use that knowledge to protect Cecilia Nightingale. In the bedroom at the back of the ranch house, Martha helped Cecilia out of her tattered clothing. The older woman's face grew increasingly grim as she noted the bruises and scratches covering the young woman's arms and back. "Those animals," Martha muttered under her breath. "Don't you worry now. Yates will handle them, and I'll take care of you." Cecilia flinched as Martha helped her into a copper bathtub filled with warm water. Her muscles ached from days of being bound, from her desperate escape through rough terrain, and from the constant fear that had kept her alert even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. As Martha gently washed the dirt and blood from her skin, Cecilia's mind drifted back to the moment everything changed. She had been in Cheyenne visiting her aunt, having traveled from her home in Boston after her father's death 6 months earlier. The stage coach to Cheyenne had seemed like an adventure, a chance to see the frontier her father had often spoken of with both wariness and fascination. Her aunt had warned her about the rougher elements in town, but Cecilia had thought herself safe in broad daylight, walking from the general store back to her aunt's home. She hadn't even heard them approach, just felt a rough hand clamp over her mouth, and the terrifying sensation of being lifted off her feet and thrown into a waiting wagon. The Blackwell Gang had initially mistaken her for the banker's daughter, a fact they discovered only after they were miles from town. Rather than release her, they had decided to hold her for ransom anyway, assuming her fine clothes meant she came from money. When she had tried to explain that her father's estate was modest and already settled, they had grown angry. The beatings had started then. For 3 days, they had moved from camp to camp, always staying ahead of any pursuit. Cecilia had screamed herself hoarse the first day, calling for help every time they passed anywhere she thought might be inhabited. Her persistence had earned her a split lip and the threat of worse if she didn't shut her pretty mouth. But then last night, as the gang had drunkenly argued over what to do with her, whether to try for a ransom, sell her to a brothel in some remote mining town, or simply have some fun before disposing of her, she had seen her chance. With the men distracted and her guard dozing by the fire, she had slipped the ropes binding her wrists using a sharp rock she'd been hiding. She had run blindly into the night, guided only by instinct and desperation. "There now," Martha said, breaking into Cecilia's painful memories. "Let's get you dried off and into some clean clothes." Martha helped her into a simple calico dress that hung a bit loose on Cecilia's frame. It was clearly one of Martha's own, but it was clean and whole, which made it feel luxurious after days in her increasingly tattered traveling dress. "It's not the latest Boston fashion," Martha said with a small smile, "but it'll do until we can get something more suitable." Cecilia tried to smile back, though the effort made her split lip sting. She reached for the paper and pencil Martha had placed on the bedside table. "Thank you," she wrote. "You're both very kind." Martha read the note and patted Cecilia's hand. "It's what decent folk do for one another out here. Now let me fix you something to eat. You look half-starved." As Martha bustled out of the room, Cecilia sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers unconsciously moving to her throat. She had always been proud of her voice. Back in Boston, she had sung in the church choir and at small gatherings. Her father had often said her voice reminded him of her mother's, a woman Cecilia had never known, having died in childbirth. Now, when she tried to produce even the simplest sound, all that came was a painful rasping. Had she lost her voice forever? The thought brought fresh tears to her eyes, but she brushed them away quickly. She was alive. That was what mattered. She would not allow self-pity when she had so narrowly escaped a fate far worse than the loss of her voice. Outside, Yates had positioned himself behind a large rock formation that gave him a clear view of the approach to his property. He didn't have to wait long before he spotted a cloud of dust in the distance, signaling riders approaching. He counted 5 figures as they drew nearer exactly as Cecilia had indicated. Yates recognized Jeremiah Blackwell at the head of the group. The outlaw's distinctive red beard and large frame made him unmistakable even at a distance. Yates had never had a direct confrontation with the Blackwell Gang, but every rancher and lawman in the territory knew of them. They were vicious, unpredictable, and according to rumor had connections that kept them informed about law enforcement movements. Yates weighed his options. He could try to pick them off from his current position, but even with his skill as a marksman, the odds of hitting all 5 before they scattered were slim. And if any escaped, they'd return with reinforcements. No, he needed to handle this differently. Setting his rifle aside temporarily, Yates mounted Thunder and rode boldly down to intercept the approaching riders. His hand remained near his revolver, and he kept enough distance to give himself reaction time if needed. "Afternoon," Yates called out as the riders approached. "You boys look like you're searching for something." Jeremiah Blackwell reined in his horse, sizing up Yates with cold eyes. "We're looking for a woman. Run away. She's not right in the head family's mighty worried." "That's so," Yates replied evenly, noting the obvious lie. "Haven't seen any women out this way aside from my housekeeper. What's she look like, this runaway of yours? Pretty little thing," one of the other men chimed in, a malicious grin spreading across his face. "Brown hair, green eyes, wearing a blue dress. Might be torn up some from wandering in the brush." Yates kept his expression neutral despite the anger flaring inside him at the man's leering tone. "Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description." Where'd you lose track of her? Blackwell's eyes narrowed suspiciously. About 5 miles east of here. Trail led this direction. Well, there's not much between here and Lusk, Yates said, gesturing vaguely toward town. If she was on foot and confused, as you say, she might have headed for the lights of town. I'd try there if I were you. Blackwell studied Yates for a long moment. You wouldn't be lying to us now, would you, Cowboy? That'd be a mistake. No reason to lie, Yates replied, meeting Blackwell's gaze steadily. I've got a ranch to run, not in the habit of hiding runaways or getting in other folks' business. One of the other riders, a wiry man with a pockmarked face, leaned forward. Boss, maybe we should have a look around his place anyway, just to be sure. Yates's hand inched closer to his revolver. My property's private. Unless you've got a warrant or the sheriff with you, I'll have to ask you to move along. Tension crackled in the air as the standoff stretched out. Yates knew he was outnumbered, but he also knew that Blackwell, for all his brutality, was calculating. Starting a gunfight with a local rancher would bring unwanted attention, especially when they were already likely being pursued for kidnapping. Finally, Blackwell spat on the ground. We'll check Lusk, but we'll be back this way if we don't find her, and if I find out you're hiding her. He left the threat hanging. Like I said, haven't seen her, Yates repeated firmly. Good luck with your search. He watched as the 5 riders turned toward Lusk, waiting until they were well out of sight before heading back to his ranch. They'd be back, he was certain of it. Which meant he needed to prepare. When Yates returned to the ranch house, he found Cecilia sitting at the kitchen table, a half-eaten bowl of stew in front of her. Martha hovered nearby, clearly having been trying to encourage the young woman to eat more. Cecilia's eyes widened at the sight of Yates, her question clear even without words. The Blackwell Gang was looking for you, all right, Yates confirmed, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. I sent them toward Lusk, but they'll be back once they realize I lied. Martha's face paled. You confronted them alone, Yates Forrester. Sometimes I think you've got more courage than sense. It was the safer play, Yates explained, helping himself to coffee from the pot on the stove. If I'd tried to ambush them and any got away, they'd have known for certain she was here. This way, we've bought some time. Cecilia frantically scribbled on her paper. I should go, don't want to bring trouble to you. Yates read her note and shook his head firmly. You're not going anywhere, Miss Nightingale. Those men would catch you before you made it 5 miles, and I won't have that on my conscience. But what are we going to do? Martha asked, wringing her hands on her apron. There are 5 of them, Yates, 5 killers. Yates took a seat at the table, his expression thoughtful. I've got a plan, but I'll need help. He turned to Cecilia. Can you ride? She nodded, then wrote, Yes, not an expert, but capable. Good, Yates said. That gives us more options. He turned to Martha. I need you to pack food and supplies for a few days. And find something warm for Miss Nightingale to wear at night. The mountains get cold, even in summer. The mountains, Martha echoed, looking concerned. I have a hunting cabin up in the Medicine Bow Range, Yates explained. Few people know about it, and those who do can't find it without a guide. It's the safest place for Miss Nightingale until I can contact the territorial marshal about the Blackwell Gang. Cecilia wrote quickly. You would do all this for a stranger? Yates read her note and smiled gently. Out here, we look after those who need help, Miss Nightingale. It's how we survive. Something in his eyes, a kindness, a steadiness, made Cecilia's heart flutter unexpectedly. It had been so long since she had felt safe, and there was something about this tall, soft-spoken cowboy that inspired trust. Besides, Yates continued, I've been looking for an excuse to go after the Blackwell Gang for some time. They've terrorized this territory for too long. Martha muttered something about fool men and their heroics as she began gathering supplies, but there was a fondness in her tone that suggested this was a familiar exchange. We'll leave at dusk, Yates decided. The gang will likely return here after searching Lusk, but they won't expect us to head into the mountains at night. It's risky, but less risky than staying put. Cecilia nodded in agreement, then wrote, What about Martha? Will she be safe? Martha will be heading to her sister's place in town, Yates said, clearly having thought this through. It would look suspicious if the house was abandoned entirely. Martha looked up from her packing. I don't like leaving you to handle this alone, Yates. I won't be alone, Yates replied, nodding toward Cecilia. And once we're at the cabin, I'll ride to Cheyenne to alert the marshal. With any luck, they'll send a proper posse to deal with Blackwell. The plan set, they spent the next few hours preparing. Yates checked and rechecked his weapons, selected the steadiest horse in his small herd for Cecilia to ride, and studied the maps of the mountain terrain, though he knew the route by heart. As the sun began to set, painting the Wyoming sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Yates led 2 saddled horses to the back door of the ranch house. Martha had packed saddlebags with essentials, and Cecilia now wore a warm woolen coat over her borrowed dress, despite the summer heat. Nights in the high country could turn cold quickly. Now you listen to me, young man, Martha said, her voice thick with emotion as she adjusted Yates's collar unnecessarily. You take care of yourself and this young lady. I expect to see you both back here safe and sound. Yes, madam, Yates replied with a smile, giving the older woman a quick hug. You be careful, too. If anyone suspicious comes asking, you don't know anything. I may be old, but I'm not addled, Martha huffed, then turned to Cecilia. You hang on tight to that horse, dear. Mountain trails aren't like city streets. Cecilia nodded and impulsively embraced Martha, trying to convey her gratitude without words. Martha seemed to understand, patting her back before stepping away. Yates helped Cecilia mount her horse, a gentle dun mare named Daisy, checking that the stirrups were properly adjusted for her height. He then swung easily into his own saddle atop Thunder. Stay close, follow my lead, and if I signal you to stop or be quiet, do so immediately, Yates instructed. It's about a 4-hour ride to the cabin if we pace ourselves, longer if we need to take detours. Cecilia signaled her understanding, and with a final wave to Martha, they set off as the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon. They rode in silence, Yates leading the way along barely visible trails that wound through scrubland and eventually began to climb into pine-covered foothills. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate by, though Yates kept their pace measured to avoid accidents in the deceptive silver light. After about 2 hours of riding, they paused in a small clearing to rest the horses and drink from their canteens. Cecilia's legs ached from the unaccustomed activity, but she made no complaint, only accepting Yates's hand gratefully when he helped her dismount. You're doing well, Yates said softly, his voice barely above a whisper in the quiet of the wilderness. We're making good time. Cecilia smiled in response, wishing desperately that she could thank him properly, engage in conversation. Ask the many questions swirling in her mind about this man who had so readily risked himself for her safety. As if reading her thoughts, Yates continued, My father used to say that the measure of a person isn't in their words but in their actions. I think sometimes silence says more than speech ever could. Cecilia felt tears prick her eyes at his understanding. She reached for his hand and squeezed it, hoping to convey her gratitude. Yates squeezed back gently, his calloused palm warm against her smaller hand. For a moment they stood like that, connected in the moonlight, before Yates cleared his throat and stepped back. We should keep moving, he said, his voice a touch rougher than before. The higher we get, the safer we'll be. As they continued their journey, the terrain grew steeper, the trail narrower. Pine trees crowded close on either side, their ricinus sent sharp in the cool night air. Occasionally, Yates would halt and listen intently, but each time he would nod reassuringly to Cecilia and press on. It was well past midnight when they finally reached a small plateau where a log cabin nestled against the mountainside, almost invisible among the trees. Yates dismounted quickly and helped Cecilia down, leading both horses to a small lean-to shelter attached to the cabin. Home, sweet home, he said with a slight smile. At least for now. The cabin was simple but solidly built, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A rough-hewn table and chairs, a small cupboard, and a narrow bed were the only furniture, aside from some shelves holding basic supplies. "It's not much," Yates apologized as he lit a lantern. "My father built it for hunting trips. I've maintained it over the years, but I don't get up here as often as I'd like." Cecilia shook her head and smiled, hoping to convey that she found the cabin perfectly adequate, even welcoming, given the circumstances. She was simply grateful for walls between her and the dangers that had pursued her. Yates busied himself starting a fire in the fireplace to ward off the mountain chill. As warmth began to fill the small space, Cecilia sank gratefully onto one of the wooden chairs, exhaustion finally catching up with her. "You should take the bed," Yates said, nodding toward it. "I'll sleep by the fire. Tomorrow I'll start down to Cheyenne to alert the marshal, but first, we both need rest." Cecilia reached for the paper and pencil she'd kept in her pocket. "Thank you," she wrote, "for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Yates read her note and shook his head. "No need for repayment, Miss Nightingale. Anyone would have done the same." Cecilia gave him a look that clearly expressed her doubt about that statement. She'd encountered enough cruelty in the past few days to know that kindness like his was far from universal. Yates seemed to understand her unspoken contradiction. "Well, perhaps not anyone," he amended, "but that's all the more reason to help when you can, I figure." As they settled in for the night, Cecilia lying on the narrow bed with a wool blanket pulled up to her chin, and Yates stretched out on a bedroll near the fire, she found herself studying his profile in the dancing firelight. There was a quiet strength in the line of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders. Yet his eyes held a gentleness that belied his rugged exterior. What kind of man, she wondered, would risk everything for a stranger? In Boston, she had known wealthy men, educated men, men of so-called refinement. Yet none had shown the simple decency that Yates Forrester had demonstrated without hesitation. As sleep claimed her, Cecilia realized that for the first time in days she felt not just safe but seen. Yates didn't need her to speak to understand her. And in that understanding, she had found an unexpected refuge. Morning arrived with golden light filtering through the cabin's small windows. Cecilia woke to the smell of coffee and the quiet sounds of Yates moving about the cabin, preparing a simple breakfast of bacon and hardtack biscuits. "Morning," he greeted when he noticed her stirring. "Hope you slept well. We've got a big day ahead." Cecilia nodded, running a hand through her tangled hair self-consciously. She wished for a comb, clean clothes, and a proper wash basin, all the simple comforts she had taken for granted before her ordeal. Seeming to read her mind again, Yates pointed to a basin of water he'd placed on the table. "It's not much, but I brought some water in from the stream. And there's a comb in that drawer if you'd like to use it." Martha packed a few things she thought you might need. Grateful beyond words, Cecilia washed her face and hands in the cool water and used the comb to tame her hair as best she could. Meanwhile, Yates busied himself outside, giving her privacy. When she emerged from the cabin, she found him checking the horses and repacking the saddlebags. "I've been thinking," Yates said as he worked. "The ride to Cheyenne is at least a day and a half each way. I don't like leaving you alone that long." Cecilia frowned and reached for her paper, but Yates continued before she could write anything. "There's a smaller settlement closer by a place called Garrett's Creek. They've got a telegraph office. If I ride there instead, I can send a wire to the marshal in Cheyenne and be back by nightfall." Cecilia wrote quickly. "Is it safe for you to travel alone? The gang is still out there." Yates read her note and nodded. "I know these mountains better than they do. And I'll be keeping to trails most folks don't know exist. Besides, they're looking for you, not me. As far as they know, I'm just a rancher who sent them on a wild goose chase." His confidence was reassuring, but Cecilia still felt a knot of anxiety at the thought of being left alone. Not because she feared for her own safety, the cabin was well hidden, and she doubted the Blackwell Gang would venture this far into unfamiliar terrain, but because she had come to feel secure in Yates's presence. As if sensing her unease, Yates added, "I'll leave you my rifle." "You know how to use one," Cecilia shook her head. Her father, a Boston merchant, had never seen the need to teach his daughter such skills. "It's simple enough," Yates said, retrieving the Winchester from where it leaned against the cabin wall. He demonstrated how to load it, aim, and fire, his hands moving with the confidence of long practice. "Just remember to brace for the kick," he advised as he handed her the weapon. "And hopefully you won't need to use it at all." Cecilia nodded, holding the rifle awkwardly. It was heavier than she'd expected, and the responsibility it represented weighed even more heavily. "I've left food in the cabin," Yates continued. "Keep the fire going but small, we don't want a lot of smoke visible from below, and if you hear anyone approaching, hide in the root cellar." He pointed to a trapdoor in the corner of the cabin that she hadn't noticed before. "It's not comfortable, but it's well hidden." Cecilia wrote, "I'll be fine, please be careful." "Always am," Yates replied with a reassuring smile. He hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about your situation. Once we've dealt with the Blackwell Gang, you'll need somewhere to go. Do you have family you can return to?" Cecilia shook her head and wrote, "My father died 6 months ago. I was visiting my aunt in Cheyenne when I was taken, but she's elderly and was already struggling to support herself." Yates frowned thoughtfully. "Well, there's no rush to decide. You're welcome to stay at my ranch until you figure things out. Martha would appreciate the company, I suspect." The offer was generous, perhaps too generous from a man she barely knew. Yet something told Cecilia that Yates Forrester's kindness came without ulterior motives. It was simply part of who he was, she wrote. "Thank you, I'd like that, at least until I can find work." Yates nodded, seemingly pleased with her response. "Then it's settled. Now, I'd best get going if I want to make it to Garrett's Creek and back before dark." He mounted Thunder, checking his revolver and the extra ammunition in his saddlebags one last time. "Remember small fire, stay inside, and use the root cellar if you hear anyone," he reminded her. "I'll be back as soon as I can." Cecilia nodded, clutching the rifle to her chest as she watched him ride away, the horse picking its way carefully down a narrow trail that disappeared into the trees. When Yates was out of sight, she returned to the cabin, suddenly very aware of the vast silence surrounding her. The day passed slowly. Cecilia kept busy tidying the already neat cabin, arranging and rearranging the few supplies, and watching the shifting patterns of sunlight through the windows. She missed having a book to read or needlework to occupy her hands. In Boston, she had rarely been without some form of entertainment or activity. Here, alone with her thoughts, she found herself reflecting on the strange turn her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been the dutiful daughter of a respectable merchant, her days filled with social calls, charitable work, and the occasional musical soiree. Her father's death had left her with modest means and few prospects, prompting her journey west to her aunt's home. Never had she imagined that journey would lead her here to a remote mountain cabin, hiding from outlaws, dependent on the kindness of a cowboy she had known for less than 2 days. Yet strangely, despite everything, Cecilia didn't regret coming west. There was a raw honesty to this place, to people like Yates and Martha, that contrasted sharply with the carefully maintained facades of Boston society. As the afternoon wore on, Cecilia found herself growing increasingly anxious about Yates's return. What if something had happened to him? What if the Blackwell Gang had caught him? Or what if he had simply decided that protecting her was too much trouble and had abandoned her here? She immediately chastised herself for the last thought. Everything about Yates Forrester suggested a man of integrity. He would return as promised. To distract herself, Cecilia stepped outside onto the small porch that fronted the cabin. The view was breathtaking, miles of pine-covered slopes giving way to distant plains that shimmered in the afternoon heat. The air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and wildflowers. A movement in the trees below caught her attention, and Cecilia's heart leaped into her throat. Was someone coming? She strained her eyes, trying to make out details through the dense forest. Then she saw it again, a deer, nothing more, picking its delicate way through the underbrush. Cecilia exhaled in relief, smiling at her own skittishness. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, when Cecilia heard the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats approaching. She quickly retreated inside the cabin, grabbing the rifle and positioning herself by the window where she could see who was coming. Relief flooded through her as Yates emerged from the trees, looking tired but unharmed. Cecilia set the rifle aside and hurried out to meet him as he dismounted. "Everything go all right?" he asked immediately, his eyes scanning her face for signs of trouble. Cecilia nodded, then gestured questioningly at him. "The telegraph operator at Garrett's Creek sent the message," Yates confirmed, "and he had some news for us. Seems the Blackwell Gang hit the bank in Lusk this morning." Cecilia's eyes widened in alarm. She pointed toward the cabin, indicating she needed to write. Once inside, she scribbled hastily. "Did anyone get hurt?" "2 people wounded, none killed," Yates replied, reading over her shoulder. "The gang got away with about $300. Not a huge haul, but enough to keep them going." "Will they come looking for me again?" Cecilia wrote. Yates shook his head. "I don't think so. According to the telegraph operator, they were seen heading south after the robbery. My guess is they've decided you're not worth the trouble. They've got the law on their trail now for the bank job, and that's a more immediate concern." Relief washed over Cecilia, though she knew better than to assume she was completely safe. The Blackwell Gang had proven themselves unpredictable and vindictive. "The marshal wired back that he's sending a posse," Yates continued. "They should reach Lusk in a couple of days. I figure we should stay here until then, just to be safe." Cecilia nodded in agreement. Despite the primitive conditions, the cabin felt like a sanctuary now. "I brought some supplies from Garrett's Creek," Yates said, lifting a package wrapped in brown paper. "Thought you might appreciate something other than bacon and hardtack." Inside the package were fresh bread, a jar of preserved peaches, and to Cecilia's delight a small book of poetry. The simple gifts touched her deeply, especially knowing that Yates had thought of her comfort during his dangerous errand. "Thank you," she wrote. "This is wonderful." Yates smiled, seeming pleased by her reaction. "Figured you might be getting bored up here alone, not much to do in a hunting cabin." They prepared a simple meal together, working in a companionable silence that had become comfortable rather than awkward. Cecilia found herself watching Yates as he moved around the small space, the careful precision of his movements, the quiet competence in everything he did. After they ate, they sat by the fire, the evening chill making its presence felt despite the summer season. Cecilia opened the book of poetry, finding comfort in the familiar verses of Wordsworth and Tennyson. "Would you read some aloud?" she wrote, offering the book to Yates. He looked surprised. "I'm not much for poetry, Miss Nightingale, never had much schooling." "Please," she wrote. "I miss hearing words." Something in her expression must have convinced him, for Yates took the book gingerly, as though afraid he might damage it. He flipped through the pages until he found a shorter poem and began to read, his deep voice hesitant at first, but growing more confident with each line. "I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils." His reading was simple, unadorned by the dramatic flourishes that were fashionable in Boston drawing rooms. Yet there was something profoundly moving about hearing these familiar words in Yates's honest voice. Cecilia closed her eyes, letting the poetry wash over her, carrying her briefly away from their precarious situation. When Yates finished the poem, he looked up to find Cecilia watching him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Did I read it that badly?" he asked, concerned. She shook her head quickly and wrote, "It was beautiful, thank you." Yates's cheeks colored slightly at the praise. "My mother used to read to me when I was a boy, not poetry like this, just stories from the Bible mostly, but she always said words had power. I never understood exactly what she meant until now." "What do you mean?" Cecilia wrote. Well, Yates said slowly, considering his words, here you are, unable to speak, yet you communicate more clearly than most folks I know who talk all day. And here I am, reading words written by a man who's probably been dead for years, and somehow they still have the power to move you. He shook his head in wonder. That's a kind of magic, I suppose. Cecilia smiled at his insight. In Boston, she had known men who quoted poetry to impress, who wielded words like weapons to demonstrate their intellectual superiority. Yates approached the poem with humility and found meaning that many more educated men missed entirely. Tell me about yourself, she wrote. Your ranch, your life here. Yates seemed uncomfortable being the center of attention, but obliged her. He spoke of growing up on the ranch his father had established, of losing both parents to fever 3 years earlier, of his struggles and successes in maintaining the property alone save for Martha's help. It's not an exciting life, he admitted, but it's a good one. Honest work, beautiful country, good neighbors when you need them. It sounds wonderful, Cecilia wrote truthfully. After the confinement and constraints of Boston society, the freedom of Yates's life held great appeal. What about you? Yates asked. What was your life like before all this? Cecilia hesitated, then began to write, filling page after page with descriptions of her life in Boston, her father's business, her limited prospects after his death, her journey west. Yates read each page attentively, sometimes asking questions that showed he was genuinely interested in understanding her world. The hours slipped by as they shared their vastly different lives, finding unexpected common ground in their values, their sense of humor, their appreciation for the simple beauty of the natural world. By the time the fire had burned low, Cecilia felt as though she had known Yates Forrester for years rather than days. As they prepared for sleep, Yates once again insisting that Cecilia take the bed while he slept by the fire, she found herself reluctant for the evening to end. There was something so peaceful about sitting across from this quiet, thoughtful man, sharing stories and ideas without the pressure to impress or perform that had characterized so many of her social interactions in Boston. "Good night, Miss Nightingale," Yates said softly as he banked the fire for the night. "Rest well." Cecilia nodded, then impulsively reached out to squeeze his hand before retreating to the narrow bed. As she drifted off to sleep, she realized with a start that she was beginning to feel something for Yates that went beyond simple gratitude. Something that both thrilled and terrified her with its unexpected intensity. The next 2 days passed in a similar fashion, with Yates and Cecilia settling into a comfortable routine in the small cabin. They took turns cooking simple meals, shared the chores of maintaining their temporary home, and spent hours in conversation, Cecilia writing, Yates reading her notes and responding thoughtfully. Each evening, Yates would read aloud from the book of poetry, his initial reluctance giving way to genuine enjoyment as he discovered the power of the written word. Cecilia found herself looking forward to these reading sessions, to the sound of Yates's deep voice giving life to verses she had previously only read silently to herself. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Yates returned from checking the horses with news. "I rode down to the ridge where I can see the valley," he said. "Spotted a group of riders heading toward Lusk. Looks like the marshal's posse has arrived." Cecilia's heart leaped at the news, though she was surprised to find the feeling tempered by a certain reluctance. Once the Blackwell Gang was captured, there would be no reason to remain hidden in this mountain sanctuary with Yates. "I think it's safe for us to head back to the ranch tomorrow," Yates continued, seemingly unaware of her mixed emotions. "We can check in Lusk on the way, see if there's news about the gang." Cecilia nodded her agreement, then wrote, "What will happen after? Will I need to testify if they're caught?" Yates frowned thoughtfully. "Probably. Your testimony would be important, even if you have to write it rather than speak it. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it." That evening, as they sat by the fire for what would likely be their last night in the cabin, A palpable tension hung in the air. Cecilia found herself watching Yates more intently than usual, memorizing the way the firelight played across his features, the careful precision of his hands as he cleaned his revolver, the gentle cadence of his voice as he read aloud. When he closed the book after finishing a particularly moving poem by Keats, Cecilia reached for her paper and wrote, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." Yates read her note and shook his head. "You don't need to thank me, Miss Nightingale. I did what anyone would do." "Not anyone," she wrote firmly. "Few would risk their lives for a stranger. Fewer still would show such kindness and understanding." Yates seemed embarrassed by her praise. "Well, you're not exactly a stranger anymore, are you?" he said with a small smile. "After these days together, I feel like I know you better than folks I've lived near for years." There was truth in his words. The intensity of their situation had accelerated the normal pace of acquaintance, creating a bond that would typically take months or years to form. "I feel the same," Cecilia wrote, "and I'm not sure I'm ready for it to end." The moment the words were written, she wished she could take them back. They revealed too much, too soon. What must Yates think of her forwardness? But when she dared to meet his gaze, she found no judgment there, only a warmth that made her heart beat faster. "It doesn't have to end," Yates said quietly. "Like I said before, you're welcome to stay at the ranch as long as you need to. Martha would love the company, and I." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I've enjoyed getting to know you, Miss Nightingale, more than I probably should admit." The simple honesty of his statement touched Cecilia deeply. In her experience, men often disguise their feelings behind flowery language or social conventions. Yates's straightforward admission was refreshingly direct. "I've enjoyed it too," she wrote. "And please call me Cecilia." Yates smiled, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "Cecilia," he repeated, as though testing the feel of her name on his lips. "It's a beautiful name." She felt herself blush at the simple compliment. "What happens tomorrow?" she wrote. "We ride back to the ranch," Yates replied. "Check in at Lusk to see what news there is of the Blackwell Gang." And then, he hesitated. "Then you decide what you want to do next. No pressure, no rush." Cecilia nodded gratefully. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time since her ordeal began, uncertainty didn't feel frightening. With Yates beside her, she felt equipped to face whatever came next. As they prepared for their last night in the cabin, Cecilia found herself lingering by the fire, reluctant to end this moment of quiet intimacy. Yates seemed similarly disinclined to sleep, adding another log to the dying flames and settling back into his chair. "Tell me something you've never told anyone else," he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Cecilia raised an eyebrow at the unexpected request, but reached for her paper. After a moment's thought, she wrote, "I've always wanted to travel west of the Mississippi. My father thought it improper for a young lady to have such adventurous aspirations, so I never told anyone. But I've dreamed of seeing the frontier since I was a child." Yates read her confession and smiled. "Well, you've certainly managed that, though perhaps not in the way you imagined." Cecilia laughed silently, her shoulders shaking with mirth at his dry observation. She gestured for Yates to reciprocate. He looked into the fire, his expression growing more serious. "I've never told anyone this, but sometimes I think about selling the ranch and starting fresh somewhere else. Maybe California or Oregon." He glanced at her, almost apologetically. "It's not that I don't love this land, I do. But sometimes I wonder if I'm only running it because it's what my father would have wanted, not because it's what I want." The admission seemed to surprise Yates himself, as though he'd never fully articulated the thought before this moment. Cecilia reached out impulsively and laid her hand on his arm, hoping to convey understanding without words. "What would you do if you could do anything?" she wrote. Yates considered the question carefully. "I'm not entirely sure. I like working with horses, breaking them, training them. Maybe I'd do more of that, or maybe I'd try my hand at guiding. I know these mountains better than most." He shrugged. "It's just a thought. The ranch is home after all." Home can be many places, Cecilia wrote, or with people rather than a place. Yates read her words and met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Yes, he said softly. I suppose that's true. The moment stretched between them, filled with possibilities neither was quite ready to voice. Finally, Yates cleared his throat and stood. We should get some sleep, he said. We've got a long ride tomorrow. Cecilia nodded, though part of her wished this night could continue indefinitely, this quiet sharing of secrets and dreams in the firelit cabin, far from the complexities of the world beyond. As she lay in the narrow bed, listening to Yates settle into his bedroll by the fire, Cecilia realized with sudden clarity that her feelings for this quiet, honorable man had grown far beyond gratitude or friendship. In just a few days, Yates Forrester had become important to her in a way no one else had ever been. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. What place could there be for such feelings in the uncertain future that awaited her? And even if she found the courage to express them, what if Yates saw her only as someone in need of his protection, not as a woman he could love? With these troubling thoughts circling in her mind, Cecilia eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. Her dreams filled with running horses and endless mountain vistas, and a tall cowboy whose blue eyes seemed to see into her very soul. Morning came too quickly, sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and rousing Cecilia from her restless slumber. She found Yates already awake, packing their few belongings and preparing a simple breakfast. Sleep well? He asked, handing her a cup of coffee. Cecilia nodded, not wanting to burden him with her troubled thoughts. They ate quickly and in silence, both seemingly aware that something had shifted between them during the night, neither quite ready to address it. Within an hour they had packed everything, doused the fire, and secured the cabin. The horses, rested and eager after days of relative inactivity, pranced impatiently as Yates helped Cecilia mount Daisy. Ready? He asked, swinging up onto Thunder's back. Cecilia nodded, taking one last look at the small cabin that had been their sanctuary. Then they were off, following a different trail down the mountainside than the one they had used to ascend. Yates explaining that this route, while slightly longer, would keep them hidden from view for most of the journey. They rode steadily throughout the morning, stopping occasionally to rest the horses or drink from their canteens. The day was pleasantly warm, the sky a clear, endless blue above the pine-covered slopes. Under different circumstances, it would have been a perfect day for a leisurely ride through beautiful country. But tension rode with them, concern about what awaited them in Lusk, uncertainty about the future, and the unspoken feelings that had developed during their days together in the cabin. It was mid-afternoon when they finally approached the outskirts of Lusk. Yates reined in Thunder, signaling for Cecilia to stop as well. I think it's best if I ride into town alone first, he said, his expression serious. Just to make sure it's safe. The Blackwell Gang might still be in the area, and I'd rather not risk you being seen until I know the situation. Cecilia frowned, reluctant to be separated from Yates even temporarily, but his logic was sound. She nodded her agreement. There's a small grove of cottonwoods just ahead, Yates continued, pointing. You can wait there, hidden from the road. I won't be more than an hour. Cecilia followed him to the grove, where a small stream provided water for the horses and shade offered relief from the afternoon sun. She dismounted, accepting Yates's help, her hands lingering on his shoulders a moment longer than necessary. I'll be back soon, he promised, his voice gentle. Stay hidden, and if anyone approaches, use the rifle. Cecilia nodded, watching as he mounted Thunder and rode toward town, his tall figure gradually diminishing with distance until he disappeared around a bend in the road. The waiting was interminable. Cecilia paced anxiously, startling at every unfamiliar sound. What if Yates encountered members of the Blackwell Gang? What if they had recognized him as the rancher who had misdirected them? What if they had taken hostages in town? Her imagination conjured increasingly dire scenarios, until she forced herself to stop, to breathe, to focus on the present moment, the sound of the stream, the rustle of leaves overhead, the occasional whicker of Daisy as she grazed nearby. It was perhaps an hour later when Cecilia heard hoofbeats approaching. She quickly retreated deeper into the grove, rifle in hand, watching the road anxiously. Relief flooded through her as Yates appeared, riding alone and looking unharmed. She stepped out from the trees, lowering the rifle as he approached. "Good news," Yates called as he dismounted. "The marshal and his posse captured 3 members of the Blackwell Gang yesterday about 20 miles south of here. Jeremiah Blackwell himself and 1 other escaped, but they're believed to be heading toward the Dakota Territory, not back this way." Cecilia's shoulders sagged with relief. She gestured questioningly. "The town's safe," Yates assured her, understanding her concern. "The bank's still repairing the damage from the robbery, but no one was killed. The telegraph operator gave me a message from the marshal. They want you to come to Cheyenne when you're able to give a statement about your kidnapping." Cecilia nodded, having expected as much. She reached for her paper and wrote, "When should we go?" "That's up to you," Yates replied. "We can head straight to Cheyenne or go back to the ranch first so you can rest properly. The marshal says there's no immediate rush now that they have most of the gang in custody." After a moment's consideration, Cecilia wrote, "I'd like to go to the ranch first if that's all right. I'm not ready to face more strangers just yet." "Of course," Yates said, his expression soft with understanding. "The ranch it is. We can be there before dark if we ride steady." They mounted up and continued toward Lusk, skirting the edge of town rather than passing directly through. Cecilia kept her head down, the brim of the hat Yates had lent her shading her face from view. Even knowing that the danger had largely passed, she couldn't shake the fear that had become her constant companion over the past week. The familiar silhouette of Yates's ranch house appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Cecilia felt an unexpected surge of emotion at the sight. Relief, certainly, but also a strange sense of homecoming that caught her by surprise. Martha must have been watching for them, for she emerged from the house before they had even reached the yard, her weathered face alight with joy. "Praise the Lord, you're both safe," she exclaimed, hurrying toward them as they dismounted. "I've been worried sick." "We're fine, Martha," Yates assured her, accepting a brief but fierce hug from the older woman. "And I've got news: the marshal caught most of the Blackwell gang." "Well, it's about time those scoundrels faced justice," Martha said firmly. She turned to Cecilia, her expression softening. "Come inside, child. You look exhausted. I've got a hot meal ready and a bath waiting." The simple domestic comforts Martha had prepared seemed like unimaginable luxury after days in the primitive cabin. Cecilia sank into the hot bath with a sigh of pure bliss, scrubbing away the dust and grime of the trail, washing her hair with lavender-scented soap that Martha had provided. Afterward, dressed in clean clothes Martha had altered to fit her slighter frame, Cecilia joined Yates and Martha for a hearty meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie. The normality of it all sitting at a proper table, using actual china rather than tin plates, engaging in the simple ritual of a shared meal felt both strange and wonderfully comforting. Throughout the meal, Yates recounted their time in the mountains, carefully editing certain details but conveying the essential facts. Martha listened attentively, occasionally glancing between Yates and Cecilia with a thoughtful expression that suggested she might be noticing things neither had voiced aloud. After dinner, pleading exhaustion, Cecilia retired to the small guest room Martha had prepared for her. The bed, though simple, felt impossibly soft after the narrow cot in the cabin. She should have fallen asleep immediately, yet found herself lying awake, staring at the moonlight patterns on the ceiling. Her mind was full of Yates, his quiet strength, his unfailing kindness, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. During their time in the cabin, something had changed between them, evolved from rescuer and rescued to something deeper, more meaningful. But what place could such feelings have in her uncertain future? Tomorrow, or perhaps the next day, they would travel to Cheyenne, where she would give her testimony against the captured members of the Blackwell Gang. And then what? Return to her elderly aunt who could barely support herself. Try to find work in Cheyenne. A single woman with no particular skills and no voice to recommend herself for. Was there another possibility, one that both thrilled and terrified her to contemplate? With these questions swirling in her mind, Cecilia finally drifted into sleep, her dreams filled with images of a small cabin nestled among pine trees and a tall cowboy reading poetry by firelight. The next morning, Cecilia woke to the sound of activity in the ranch yard, the lowing of cattle, the whicker of horses, men's voices calling instructions to each other. For a moment, disoriented, she thought she was back in Boston, hearing the street vendors outside her window. Then reality returned, and with it, a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. She dressed quickly in the clothes Martha had provided, a simple calico dress that was a bit loose but clean and whole, and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Martha kneading bread dough with practiced efficiency. "Good morning, dear," Martha greeted her warmly. "Did you sleep well?" Cecilia nodded, then gestured questioningly toward the yard, where the sounds of activity continued. "Yates and the hands are moving some cattle to the north pasture," Martha explained. "Normal ranch business can't stop just because there's been excitement." She smiled. "He said to tell you he'll be back by noon, and then you two can discuss when to head to Cheyenne." Cecilia found paper and pencil on a small desk in the corner and wrote, "Can I help with anything?" Martha read the note and smiled. "That's kind of you to offer. How are you with a needle and thread?" "I've got some mending that needs doing, and my eyes aren't what they used to be." Grateful for the chance to be useful, Cecilia spent the morning helping Martha with various household tasks, mending shirts, shelling peas for dinner, and even attempting to learn how to make biscuits under Martha's patient instruction. The domestic activities were soothing, giving her mind a rest from the constant swirl of worries and uncertainties. It was just past noon when Yates returned to the house, his shirt damp with sweat from the morning's work. He paused in the doorway, and Cecilia was struck anew by his presence, tall and solid in the doorframe, his face bronzed from years in the sun, his blue eyes finding hers immediately. "Morning, ladies," he greeted them, removing his hat. "Something smells good." Cecilia helped make the biscuits for lunch, Martha informed him with a note of pride in her voice. "She's a quick learner, this one." Yates smiled at Cecilia, and she felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the hot stove. "Is that so? Well, I look forward to trying them." Over lunch, Yates outlined his plan. "I've been thinking we should head to Cheyenne tomorrow. It's about a 2-day ride, but we can take the stage most of the way and be more comfortable." Cecilia nodded her agreement. As much as she'd come to feel safe at the ranch, the sooner she gave her testimony, the sooner the captured members of the Blackwell Gang would face justice for their crimes. "Will you be staying in Cheyenne afterward?" Martha asked, her tone carefully neutral but her eyes keenly observant. Cecilia hesitated, then wrote, "I'm not sure yet. My aunt lives there, but her situation is difficult." "No rush to decide," Yates said quickly, perhaps sensing her discomfort. "One step at a time." After lunch, Yates returned to his work and Cecilia continued helping Martha around the house. By the time evening fell, she had settled into a comfortable routine, almost as though she had always been part of this household. As they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Cecilia found herself stealing glances at Yates. He seemed lost in thought, his expression contemplative as he gazed toward the distant mountains. What was he thinking? Did he share the confusing tangle of emotions that had been growing within her? Or did he see her merely as a responsibility, a duty of care that would end once she had given her testimony in Cheyenne? As if sensing her gaze, Yates turned to look at her, a soft smile forming on his lips. "Penny for your thoughts," he said. Cecilia reached for the pad of paper she now kept with her constantly and wrote, "Just thinking about how much has changed in such a short time." Yates nodded, understanding in his eyes. Life can turn on a dime out here, for better or worse. "Mostly better, I think," she wrote, feeling a flush rise to her cheeks at the admission. Yates seemed about to respond when Martha appeared at the door, announcing that she was retiring for the night and suggesting they should do the same given their early start tomorrow. "Martha's right," Yates said, rising from his chair. "We should get some rest." As they entered the house, Yates paused, seeming to want to say something more, but after a moment he simply wished Cecilia good night and headed toward his own room. Left alone with her thoughts, Cecilia wondered if she had imagined the moment of connection on the porch. Was she seeing what she wanted to see rather than what was truly there? The journey to Cheyenne the next day was undertaken mostly in silence. They rode to Lusk, where they caught the stagecoach heading south. The coach was only half full, allowing Cecilia and Yates to sit together without the crowding that often characterized stage travel. Cecilia spent much of the journey gazing out the window at the passing landscape, occasionally writing notes to Yates when something caught her interest or a question occurred to her. He responded thoughtfully to each note, his patience with her silent communication never wavering. By the time they reached Cheyenne late the following day, Cecilia felt both exhausted and anxious. The city, though small by Eastern standards, seemed overwhelmingly busy and noisy after the peace of the ranch and the mountain cabin. "We'll get a room at the hotel," Yates said as they disembarked from the stage. "Tomorrow we can visit the marshal's office, and then you might want to call on your aunt." The idea of seeing her aunt again brought mixed emotions. Aunt Ida had been kind enough, but her small home had barely space for herself, let alone a niece with no prospects. And how would she react to Cecilia's inability to speak? Would she see it as another burden, another complication in an already difficult life? The hotel was modest but clean, a step above the typical establishment catering to cowboys and miners. Yates secured 2 adjoining rooms and arranged for hot water to be brought up for washing. "Try to rest," he advised as they parted at their doors. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Alone in her room, Cecilia found herself restless despite her fatigue. Through the thin walls, she could hear Yates moving about in the adjacent room, the sound oddly comforting in the strange environment. On impulse, she took out her paper and wrote a note. "Thank you for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you." She slipped the note under the connecting door, then retreated to her bed, her heart pounding with an emotion she couldn't quite name. A few moments later, a gentle knock came at the connecting door. When she opened it, Yates stood there, her note in his hand, his expression unreadable. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." There was something in his voice, a depth of feeling that made Cecilia's breath catch. She gestured for him to wait and quickly wrote another note. "Why?" Yates read the single word and looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "Because in all my life I've never met anyone like you, Cecilia Nightingale." The simplicity of his statement, the raw honesty in his blue eyes, made Cecilia's heart race. She wrote quickly, "I feel the same way about you." Yates stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool evening air. "I know the timing is all wrong," he said, his voice low. "You've been through a terrible ordeal, you're still recovering, and your future is uncertain. I have no right to add to your burdens. But I can't help feeling that meeting you, despite all the terrible circumstances, might be the best thing that's ever happened to me." Cecilia's eyes filled with tears at his words, not of sadness, but of a joy so intense it was almost painful. She reached out and touched his cheek, a gesture that conveyed more than any written words could express. Yates covered her hand with his own, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't know what happens next, Cecilia. I don't know if you'll want to stay in Cheyenne or go back east or—" He hesitated. "Or if you might consider coming back to the ranch, not as someone who needs protection, but as someone who belongs there, with me." It was as close to a declaration as he could make, given all the uncertainties that still surrounded them, and it was enough, more than enough. Cecilia nodded, tears spilling over onto her cheeks now. She wrote quickly, her hand trembling with emotion. "I'd like that very much, more than anything." Yates read her words, and the smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was gentle, reverent, and filled with promise. When they parted, both breathing a little faster, Yates touched his forehead to hers. "One step at a time," he murmured. "First, we deal with the marshal and make sure you're truly safe. Then we can figure out the rest, together." Cecilia nodded, unable to remember ever feeling so perfectly understood, so completely accepted, as she did in this moment with this man who had seen through her silence to the person beneath. As Yates reluctantly returned to his own room, promising to meet her for breakfast in the morning, Cecilia felt a sense of peace settle over her. Her future remained uncertain. In many ways her voice might never fully recover. The remaining members of the Blackwell Gang were still at large, and she had yet to determine her place in this new Western life. But for the first time since her ordeal began, uncertainty didn't feel frightening. With Yates by her side, she could face whatever came next. He understood her silence, respected her strength, and offered her not just protection but partnership. And in that understanding, she had found something she hadn't even known. She was searching for a place to belong, a person to share her life with, a love born in the most unexpected circumstances, but no less real for that. As she drifted off to sleep, Cecilia's last thought was of Yates reading poetry by firelight, his deep voice giving beautiful form to words that captured the wonder and complexity of human hearts finding each other across all odds. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as Cecilia and Yates made their way to the marshal's office in the heart of Cheyenne. The building was modest but imposing, its purpose clear in the serious expressions of the men who entered and exited throughout the day. Marshal James Harker was a tall, stern-faced man with a reputation for fairness and determination. He greeted Cecilia and Yates in his cluttered office, his weathered face softening slightly when Yates explained Cecilia's inability to speak. "I'm mighty sorry for what you've been through, Miss Nightingale," the marshal said, offering Cecilia a chair. "But your testimony, even written, will be crucial in ensuring those outlaws hang for their crimes." Over the next several hours, Cecilia wrote a detailed account of her kidnapping, captivity, and escape, occasionally pausing to answer the marshal's clarifying questions. Yates remained by her side throughout, his steady presence a comfort as she relived the most terrifying days of her life. "You've been very brave, Miss Nightingale," Marshal Harker said when they had finished, "and very helpful. We'll need you to testify at the trial, but that won't be for a few weeks yet. In the meantime, I'd advise staying somewhere safe. Jeremiah Blackwell is still at large, and he's not a man who forgives easily." "She'll be staying at my ranch," Yates said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. "No safer place in the territory." The marshal nodded, seemingly satisfied with this arrangement. "I'll send word when the trial date is set. And Mr. Forrester, I'm obliged to you for your assistance in this matter. Not every man would have taken the risks you did for a stranger." Yates glanced at Cecilia, something warm and private in his gaze. "Some things are worth the risk, Marshal." After leaving the marshal's office, they made their way to Cecilia's aunt's small home on the outskirts of Cheyenne. Aunt Ida, a thin, careworn woman in her 60s, broke into tears at the sight of her niece, having feared the worst when Cecilia disappeared. The reunion was emotional and somewhat awkward, with Cecilia struggling to communicate her experiences through hastily written notes, and Aunt Ida alternating between joy at her niece's survival and horror at what she had endured. "But your voice," Aunt Ida kept saying, distress evident in her faded blue eyes. "Will it ever return?" Cecilia shrugged, trying to convey acceptance of a situation she couldn't change. Yates, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "The doctor at Garrett's Creek thought it might," he said gently, "with time and rest, but even if it doesn't." He looked at Cecilia, his expression full of an emotion that made her heart skip a beat. "She communicates just fine in other ways." Aunt Ida, perceptive despite her years, glanced between them with sudden understanding. "I see," she said softly. "You two have become close." Cecilia nodded, unashamed of her feelings even if they had developed with unexpected speed. Aunt Ida seemed to consider this for a moment, then surprised them both by smiling warmly. "Well, that's something good to come out of this terrible business, at least," she declared. "Cecilia, my dear, I've worried about you being alone in the world, especially since your father's passing. If you found someone worthy of you," she gave Yates an appraising look, "and he certainly seems to be from what you've written about his actions, then I couldn't be happier." The visit concluded with promises to stay in touch and an invitation for Aunt Ida to visit the ranch when she felt up to the journey. As they walked back toward the hotel, Cecilia felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Her aunt's blessing, though not necessary, was nonetheless a comfort. "Your aunt seems like a good woman," Yates observed as they walked. "Reminds me a bit of Martha, that same practical strength." Cecilia nodded in agreement, then gestured questioningly at their surroundings, wondering about their next steps. "I figure we'll stay one more night in Cheyenne," Yates said, understanding her unspoken question. "Give you a chance to rest after today's ordeal. Then head back to the ranch tomorrow if that suits you." Cecilia nodded eagerly. Though they had been away only a few days, she found herself missing the ranch, the open spaces, the clean air, the sense of peace she had found there. Or perhaps what she really missed was the feeling of being at home, a feeling she was beginning to associate strongly with Yates himself. That evening, they dined in the hotel restaurant, sitting across from each other at a small table near the window. Cecilia was acutely aware of the glances they received from other diners' curiosity about the silent woman and her cowboy companion, but found she didn't mind. Let them wonder. What she and Yates shared was too precious to be diminished by strangers' speculation. Over dessert, a surprisingly good apple pie that nonetheless couldn't compare to Martha's. Yates seemed deep in thought, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Something on your mind," Cecilia wrote, sliding the note across the table. Yates looked up, seeming almost startled, as though he'd forgotten where he was. "Just thinking about the future," he admitted. "About possibilities." "What kind of possibilities?" she wrote, her heart beating a little faster at his serious expression. Yates hesitated, then reached across the table to take her hand. "The kind that involve you staying at the ranch not just for safety or convenience, but because it's become your home, because we've become—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Because what's growing between us is something worth building a life around." Cecilia's breath caught at the simple sincerity of his words. No flowery declarations, no grand promises, just honest emotion and an invitation to create something lasting together. "I know it's sudden," Yates continued, misinterpreting her silence as hesitation. "And I understand if you need time to think about it. After everything you've been through," Cecilia squeezed his hand to stop him, then quickly wrote, "It's not too sudden, not when you feel it's right." "And this feels right, Yates, more right than anything I've ever known." Relief and joy spread across Yates's face as he read her words. "It does, doesn't it? Like finding something you didn't even know you were looking for." They lingered over their coffee, hands entwined on the table, discussing practical matters, how Cecilia might contribute to the ranch, what skills she could develop, how they would handle her eventual testimony at the trial. But beneath the practical conversation ran a current of excitement, of anticipation for the life they were beginning to envision together. Later, as they stood outside their adjoining rooms, Yates took both of Cecilia's hands in his. "When we get back to the ranch," he said softly, "I'd like to court you properly, if that's something you'd want." Cecilia smiled and nodded, touched by his old-fashioned sensibility. She released one hand to write, "I'd like that very much. Though I think we're a bit beyond the getting to know you stage, considering everything we've shared." Yates chuckled at her observation. "Fair point, but some traditions are worth keeping, I think. Besides," he added with a mischievous glint in his eye, "I never got to take you on a proper picnic or to a dance. Seems like I've missed some important steps." "We'll make our own traditions," Cecilia wrote, her heart full of affection for this man who balanced strength with gentleness, boldness with respect. "That we will," Yates agreed, bending to place a soft kiss on her forehead. "Good night, Cecilia, sweet dreams." As she closed her door, Cecilia leaned against it, a smile playing on her lips. Despite everything, the trauma of her kidnapping, the loss of her voice, the uncertainty that still surrounded the remaining members of the Blackwell Gang, she felt a happiness that seemed almost inappropriate given recent events. Yet she couldn't bring herself to feel guilty for that happiness. Life was too precious, too fragile to deny joy when it appeared, regardless of the circumstances. The journey back to the ranch was made in a spirit of quiet anticipation. Both Cecilia and Yates aware that they were returning not just to a place, but to the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The stagecoach ride to Lusk, followed by the horseback journey to the ranch, passed quickly, filled with comfortable silences and occasional written conversations about their plans and hopes. Martha greeted them with her usual practical warmth, though Cecilia didn't miss the knowing look the older woman gave them as they explained the outcome of their visit to Cheyenne. "Well, it's about time," was all Martha said when Yates awkwardly mentioned his intention to court Cecilia properly. "I was beginning to think I'd have to drop some heavy hints." Life at the ranch quickly settled into a pleasant routine. Cecilia, determined to be useful, learned ranching skills with an enthusiasm that sometimes amused and always impressed Yates. She might have been raised in Boston, but she tackled each new challenge from helping with the horses to assisting Martha with preserving the garden's harvest for winter with a determination that earned the respect of everyone on the ranch. True to his word, Yates courted her with a sweet formality that might have seemed out of place on a working ranch, but somehow suited them perfectly. There were picnics by the stream that ran through the property, evening rides to watch the sunset from a favorite ridge, and even a trip into Lusk for the harvest dance, where they waltzed together under the approving eyes of the townspeople who had heard their story. Through it all, Cecilia's voice remained silent, though the doctor in Lusk who examined her throat held out hope for eventual improvement. "The damage isn't permanent," he had declared after his examination. "With time and rest, you should regain at least some of your voice, though perhaps not its former strength." Cecilia had accepted this prognosis with equanimity. While she missed singing and the ease of verbal communication, she had discovered that silence had its own eloquence. And Yates, with his uncanny ability to read her expressions and gestures, often seemed to understand her thoughts before she had even written them down. 6 weeks after their return from Cheyenne, word came that the trial of the captured members of the Blackwell Gang would begin the following week. Cecilia received the news with mixed emotions: relief that justice would finally be served, anxiety about facing her captors again, and dread at the thought of reliving her ordeal through testimony. The night before they were to depart for Cheyenne, Yates found Cecilia sitting on the porch, staring at the star-filled sky with a pensive expression. "Worried about the trial?" he asked softly, settling into the chair beside her. Cecilia nodded, then wrote, "What if they're not convicted?" "What if they escape?" "They won't," Yates said firmly. "The marshal has them under heavy guard and the evidence against them is overwhelming. Your testimony is just the final piece." "And what about Jeremiah Blackwell?" she wrote. "He's still out there somewhere." Yates's expression hardened. "The marshal has men searching for him across 3 territories. He won't get far and he won't get near you again. I promise you that." His certainty was comforting, but Cecilia couldn't entirely shake her unease. She had one more fear, one she was almost embarrassed to voice, but Yates had always been honest with her, and she owed him the same honesty. "I'm afraid of how people will see me," she wrote at last. "The poor, mute victim. I don't want to be defined by what happened to me or by what I've lost." Yates read her words and reached for her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "No one who truly knows you could ever see you that way, Cecilia. You're one of the strongest, most resilient people I've ever met. What happened to you is part of your story, yes, but it's not all of who you are." Not even close. The simple understanding in his words brought tears to Cecilia's eyes. She leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Besides," Yates continued, a hint of humor entering his voice, "anyone who's seen you break that wild mare last week would be hard-pressed to call you a poor victim of anything." Cecilia laughed silently, remembering the triumph she had felt when the spirited young horse had finally accepted her guidance after days of patient work. It had been a moment of pure joy, one of many she had experienced since coming to the ranch. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as a shooting star traced a bright path across the heavens. Then, with a slight hesitation that was uncharacteristic of him, Yates reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. "I've been carrying this around for a couple of weeks now, waiting for the right moment," he said, his voice suddenly husky with emotion. "I'm not sure this is it, with the trial looming and everything so uncertain, but then I thought, when have things ever been certain for us? We met in the midst of danger, grew close in a mountain hideaway, and somehow found something rare and precious in the most unlikely circumstances." He opened his palm to reveal a simple gold ring with a small diamond that caught the starlight and sparkled like their own private star. "It was my mother's," Yates explained. "My father gave it to her when they decided to build a life together on this land. It would honor me beyond words if you would wear it, Cecilia, if you would consider becoming my wife." For one of the few times since losing her voice, Cecilia desperately wished she could speak, could tell Yates exactly what he meant to her, how he had not only saved her life but given her a reason to embrace it fully again. But perhaps words weren't necessary. Not between them. She took the paper and wrote with a slightly trembling hand, "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Yates's smile as he read her answer was like sunshine breaking through clouds. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as though it had been made for her, and then gathered her into his arms, his kiss a promise more binding than any words could have been. When they finally parted, breathless and glowing with shared joy, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens at the trial, whatever the future holds, we'll face it together," he vowed. "That's my promise to you." Cecilia nodded, feeling a peace that transcended her lingering fears about the trial. With Yates beside her, she could face anything, even confronting the men who had caused her so much suffering. The trial in Cheyenne was a solemn affair, the courthouse packed with curious onlookers, eager to witness justice being served to the notorious Blackwell Gang. Cecilia's written testimony, read aloud by the prosecutor, was damning in its detailed account of the gang's cruelty. Though she trembled slightly when facing her former captors across the courtroom, she met their hateful stares with a dignity that impressed even the most hardened observers. Yates never left her side throughout the proceedings, his steady presence a constant reminder that she was no longer alone, no longer vulnerable. And when the verdict was announced guilty on all counts, with sentences of hanging for the men directly responsible for kidnapping and abusing her, the primary emotion Cecilia felt was not vindication or triumph, but relief. A chapter of her life was closing, allowing her to focus fully on the future she and Yates were building together. They were married 2 weeks after the trial, in a simple ceremony at the ranch with Martha, Aunt Ida, and a few close neighbors in attendance. Cecilia wore a dress of ivory satin that Martha had helped her sew, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a formal veil. Yates, looking both proud and slightly uncomfortable in his best suit, stumbled over his vows but spoke them with such heartfelt sincerity that there wasn't a dry eye among the guests. When the minister prompted Cecilia for her response, she had prepared to nod and present written vows. But as she looked into Yates's beloved face, something unexpected happened. From deep within, she found a whisper of sound, raspy and faint but audible in the hushed gathering. "I do," she managed, the words painful but clear. "I love you." Yates's eyes widened in astonishment, then filled with tears of joy. "I love you too," he whispered, gathering her hands in his. "More than I could ever say." The small miracle of those spoken words seemed an appropriate blessing for their marriage, a symbol of healing and new beginnings. Though Cecilia's voice remained fragile, requiring her to rely primarily on writing for communication, she found she could speak brief phrases when it truly mattered, like whispering, "I love you" to Yates in the quiet of their bedroom, or later, murmuring softly to the children who would eventually join their family. Life on the ranch was never easy. There were droughts and harsh winters, economic downturns and personal losses. But through it all, Cecilia and Yates faced each challenge together, their bond only strengthening with each obstacle overcome. 3 years after their marriage, word came that Jeremiah Blackwell had finally been captured in Montana territory after a failed bank robbery. His subsequent hanging brought final closure to the dark chapter of Cecilia's life, though by then she had largely moved beyond those memories, focusing instead on the joy of her present and the promise of her future. By their 5th anniversary, they had welcomed 2 children, a son named Henry after Yates's father, and a daughter they called Rose for the wildflowers that had decorated Cecilia's hair on their wedding day. The ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, with Cecilia's Eastern education complementing Yates's practical knowledge in ways that benefited their business and their growing reputation in the community. On the evening of that anniversary, after the children had been tucked into bed, Yates and Cecilia sat on the same porch where he had proposed, watching another spectacular Wyoming sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson. "You ever regret it?" Yates asked suddenly. "Coming west?" All that happened, Cecilia, who had regained enough of her voice for quiet conversation, though it remained husky and limited, shook her head. "Never," she said simply. "How could I regret the journey that led me to you?" Yates smiled, taking her hand in his as they had done countless times over the years. "I used to think everything happened for a reason," he mused. "Then I wondered how there could be any good reason for what you suffered. But now I think maybe it's not that things happen for a reason, but that we create meaning from what happens. We choose what to build from the pieces life gives us. And we've built something beautiful," Cecilia whispered, resting her head against his shoulder. As twilight deepened around them and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they sat in the comfortable silence that had become their special language, a silence no longer born of trauma, but of understanding so deep that words, written or spoken, were often unnecessary. Cecilia's voice had been damaged by screaming for help in her darkest hours, but Yates had understood her silence from the beginning, had seen through to her true self when she had no words to express it. And in that understanding, they had found a love that transcended language, that spoke through actions and presence, and the quiet communion of 2 souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed. Together, they had transformed her silence from a symbol of loss into a sacred space where the deepest truths could be shared without a single word being spoken.